Miss Marple and the Sewing Circle Mystery. A warm welcome to you all from Warm Pages. I'm Edward, your host for tonight, and I'm so happy you're here. Tell me, where are you tuning in from and how has your day treated you? I always enjoy hearing from you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now, let's begin the mystery. Chapter 1. The Thursday Sewing Circle. The afternoon sun, filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Brooker's sitting room, cast delicate patterns across the worn Persian carpet. It was the sort of mild autumn day that St. Mary Mead did particularly well, when the air held just enough warmth to be comfortable, and the first hints of wood smoke from distant chimneys mingled with the scent of late-blooming roses. Miss Jane Marple, settling herself into a chintz-covered chair by the window, reflected that Thursday afternoons had acquired a particular rhythm over the years. The sewing circle had been meeting for nearly 2 decades now, ever since Miss Brooker had inherited her aunt's cottage and decided that the sitting room was altogether too spacious for one person alone. "Such a pleasure to have you join us, Miss Marple," Miss Brooker said, bustling about with cushions and footstools. She was a thin, energetic woman of 60, with the sort of brisk efficiency that masked a fundamentally anxious nature. "I know you don't often attend, but we do so value your company when you do." "You're very kind," Miss Marple replied, extracting her knitting from her capacious bag. She had brought knitting rather than embroidery today, a practical choice, as knitting required less concentration and allowed for more observation. "I thought it might be pleasant to have a little society." In truth, Miss Marple had her reasons for attending. She had encountered Mrs. Clement in the village that morning, and that good lady had mentioned, rather carefully, that poor Miss Brooker was finding the atmosphere at the sewing circle rather strained of late. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had a gift for understatement that generally indicated something worth investigating. Their sitting room gradually filled with the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead's female society. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived first, as she generally did, sailing in with the air of one conferring a favour by her presence. She was followed by her companion, Miss Weatherby, a faded woman who carried Mrs. Price Ridley's elaborate sewing basket and murmured agreement with everything that lady said. "The traffic on the High Street is becoming quite impossible," Mrs. Price Ridley announced. Though St. Mary Mead's traffic consisted chiefly of the occasional motor car and Mr. Baker's delivery van. "I was nearly run down by that dreadful boy on his bicycle." "How very alarming," Miss Brooker said automatically, though her attention was clearly elsewhere, fixed on the window overlooking the garden path. She was watching, Miss Marple noted, for particular arrivals. Mrs. Hawtrey came next, a comfortable, gossipy woman whose husband had been something in imports before his retirement. She settled herself with a contented sigh and immediately began unpacking an extraordinary quantity of materials from her bag. "I'm attempting a cushion cover," she explained to no one in particular. "The pattern looked quite simple in the magazine, but I'm beginning to have my doubts. There seem to be rather more colours than I anticipated." Miss Marple smiled. Mrs. Hawtrey's optimistic embarkation on complex projects was a familiar feature of these gatherings, as was her eventual abandonment of them halfway through. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly when Mrs. Amelia Bright entered. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, well dressed in a way that suggested both prosperity and careful attention to social position. Her manner was cordial, but Miss Marple detected something brittle beneath the surface pleasantness. "Miss Brooker, how charming everything looks," Mrs. Bright said, though her gaze swept the room with the assessing quality of one taking inventory. "I hope I'm not late. I was detained by a rather tiresome matter concerning the parish hall committee." "Not at all, not at all," Miss Brooker assured her, though her fingers plucked nervously at her collar. "We're still waiting for Eleanor, Miss Finch, that is." Something flickered across Mrs. Bright's face at the name. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by a bland smile, but Miss Marple had seen it. She had seen, too, the way Mrs. Bright had chosen her seat with particular care, positioning herself on the sofa with a clear view of the door. "I do hope Miss Finch hasn't been taken ill," Miss Weatherby ventured timidly. "She wasn't at church on Sunday." Eleanor Finch is as healthy as a horse, Mrs. Price Ridley stated with her customary authority on all subjects. I saw her in the village just yesterday, looking perfectly well. Rather preoccupied, perhaps, but well. Mrs. Hawtrey leaned forward with the air of one about to impart interesting information. I happened to see her near the churchyard earlier this week. She seemed to be having quite an intense conversation with— Oh, there she is now, Miss Brooker interrupted, rising with evident relief as the gate clicked and a figure appeared on the path. Miss Marple observed this interruption with interest. It had been a little too quick, a little too forceful. Miss Brooker was not normally the interrupting type. Eleanor Finch was a tall, spare woman of 70, with the upright carriage and firm step of one who had been a headmistress in her younger days. She carried herself with a certain dignity that age had not diminished, though Miss Marple noted that her face was drawn and there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of troubled sleep. My apologies for my tardiness, Miss Finch said as she entered. Her voice was measured and precise. I was finishing a section of work and quite lost track of time. She took the remaining chair, which happened to place her directly opposite Mrs. Bright. The two women's eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Miss Marple saw something that made her knitting needles pause. It was not merely dislike or social awkwardness. It was something deeper and more dangerous, a kind of wary recognition, like two duelists acknowledging each other across a field. "What are you working on, Eleanor?" Mrs. Hawtrey asked with genuine interest. "You always have such lovely patterns." Miss Finch drew out her embroidery hoop with a slight hesitation. "A row of violets," she said. "Nothing elaborate. I find the familiar patterns soothing." She began to set up her materials with methodical care, arranging her silks in their customary order, checking her needles. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were not entirely steady. The conversation settled into its usual patterns: parish affairs, the upcoming harvest festival, Mrs. Price Ridley's opinions on modern manners. But beneath the surface chatter, Miss Marple sensed undercurrents that troubled the placid waters of St. Mary Mead Society. Mrs. Bright worked on a large piece of cutwork, her needle moving with quick, almost aggressive precision. She contributed to the conversation with appropriate remarks, but her attention repeatedly drifted to Miss Finch, watching the older woman with an intensity she attempted to disguise. Miss Finch, for her part, seemed absorbed in her embroidery, but Miss Marple noticed how her shoulders remained tense, how she held herself with the alertness of someone expecting an unpleasant encounter. "I hear the Henderson's cottage has finally sold," Mrs. Hawtrey remarked. "The one that backs onto your property, Mrs. Bright. You'll be having new neighbours." Mrs. Bright's needle paused for just a fraction of a second. "Indeed, I hope they prove suitable." "The estate agent mentioned something about boundary surveys," Mrs. Hawtrey continued innocently. "Apparently there was some confusion about the exact lines. Old properties can be so troublesome that way." The silence that followed was brief but profound. Miss Brooker began chattering nervously about the quality of the tea she was preparing. Mrs. Price Ridley launched into a monologue about property values, but Miss Marple had seen Miss Finch's head lift sharply at the word boundary, had seen the colour rise in Mrs. Bright's carefully powdered cheeks. "Surveys can indeed be most enlightening," Miss Finch said quietly, her eyes on her embroidery. "Old records sometimes reveal surprising discrepancies." "I'm sure any discrepancies would be entirely innocent," Mrs. Bright replied, her tone light but her knuckles white around her needle. "Merely the result of imprecise measurements in the past." "Oh, quite possibly," Miss Finch agreed, "though sometimes one discovers that discrepancies are rather more deliberate than they appear." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she observed this exchange. It reminded her of the time when Mrs. Harmon and Mrs. Gibbons had disputed the ownership of a plum tree. Such small matters in themselves, but behind them lay questions of honesty, of character, of what people would do when they believed no one was watching. The tea arrived, providing a welcome distraction. Miss Brooker poured with shaking hands, and Miss Marple accepted her cup with gentle thanks. She watched as the other ladies were served, noting who took sugar, who preferred lemon, the small domestic details that so often prove significant. As the afternoon waned, the light through the lace curtains grew golden and slanting. The conversation continued in fits and starts, never quite recovering its ease. Miss Finch worked steadily on her violet pattern, her needle moving in and out with rhythmic precision. Mrs. Bright maintained her social smile, but there was something watchful in her gaze, something calculating. Miss Marple finished her row of knitting and began another. She was thinking, as she often did, about human nature, how it remained remarkably consistent beneath all the varied surfaces of social position and circumstance. She was thinking, too, about the peculiar tension in this room, about interrupted sentences and meaningful glances, about old records and new surveys. She was thinking that Thursday afternoons in St. Mary Mead might be about to become considerably more interesting. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 4, its gentle notes falling into a room that had grown somehow increasingly watchful and increasingly still. Chapter 2. A thimble dropped, a woman fallen. The afternoon had settled into that peculiar lull that sometimes occurs in gatherings where surface pleasantness masks deeper currents. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm as she observed the room with the air of gentle abstraction that so often led people to forget she was observing at all. Mrs. Price Ridley had embarked upon a lengthy discourse concerning the declining standards of the Women's Institute, a subject that required no particular response from her audience. Miss Weatherby murmured agreement at intervals. Mrs. Hawtrey had abandoned her cushion cover in favour of examining a new embroidery pattern she had discovered in a magazine. Miss Brooker moved about the room with unnecessary frequency, adjusting cushions and refilling teacups that were still half full. Miss Finch worked steadily on her violet pattern, her head bent over the embroidery hoop. The violets were taking shape with careful precision, delicate purple petals, green leaves, the whole design showing the methodical skill of someone who had spent years teaching others the importance of accuracy and attention to detail. Mrs. Bright's cutwork lay abandoned in her lap. She had contributed little to the conversation for the past quarter hour, and Miss Marple noticed that her attention had fixed itself upon Miss Finch with an intensity that seemed to require considerable effort to maintain. "More tea, Eleanor, since subject." Miss Brooker asked, hovering near Miss Finch's chair with the pot. "Thank you, that would be pleasant," Miss Finch replied, without looking up from her work. Miss Marple watched as Miss Brooker poured, noting the slight tremor in their hostess's hand that caused the teacup to rattle faintly against its saucer. Nerves, she thought, or perhaps something more specific. Miss Brooker had been unusually agitated throughout the afternoon, starting at small sounds, losing the thread of conversations. The fresh cup of tea sat on the small table at Miss Finch's elbow, steaming gently. Miss Finch continued her embroidery for several minutes before reaching for it, still absorbed in her work. She took a sip, then another, her attention never leaving the violet she was stitching. "I must say, Eleanor, your work is always so precise," Mrs. Hawtrey remarked. "I don't know how you achieve such even stitches. Mine always seem to wander about as though they have minds of their own." Miss Finch looked up with the faint smile of someone accepting a familiar compliment. "It's merely a matter of practice and patience, Mrs. Hawtrey. I used to tell my girls, that embroidery teaches discipline as much as skill." "You must miss your teaching," Miss Brooker said, settling into her chair at last. "All those years at the school shaping young minds." "I do miss certain aspects," Miss Finch admitted, "though I confess I don't miss the administrative disputes or the endless committee meetings. There's something to be said for a quiet retirement where one can focus on matters of genuine importance." Miss Marple's needles paused for just an instant. The emphasis Miss Finch had placed on genuine importance had been slight but unmistakable, and it had caused Mrs. Bright to shift in her seat with a rustle of silk. "Surely you don't find embroidery as important as education," Mrs. Price Ridley said with a slight laugh. "It's a pleasant pastime, naturally, but hardly significant." "I find," Miss Finch said carefully, taking another sip of tea, "that seemingly simple activities can sometimes serve purposes beyond their immediate appearance. A piece of needlework, for instance, might contain information as clearly as any written document if one knows how to read it. The room had grown very quiet. Even Mrs. Price Ridley seemed to sense that something more was being discussed than the relative merits of embroidery. "What an intriguing notion," Miss Marple said gently. "I've often thought that patterns can be most revealing. In St. Mary Mead, one learns to read all sorts of signs, a curtain that twitches at an unusual hour, a garden suddenly neglected, a person who changes their habitual routines, small things but illuminating." Miss Finch's eyes met hers with a flash of recognition and something else, perhaps gratitude, perhaps a warning. "Precisely, Miss Marple. Small things can indeed be most illuminating. One might even say that truth has a way of emerging through the most unexpected channels, if someone takes the trouble to look carefully." Mrs. Bright rose abruptly, her cut-work falling to the floor unheeded. "I really must," she began, but Miss Finch was speaking again, her voice growing slightly strained. "For instance, old records can be remarkably informative. Land surveys, property boundaries, that sort of thing. They tell stories about how things were originally established, before certain adjustments might have occurred." "Eleanor," Miss Brooker said anxiously, "are you quite well? You look rather flushed." Miss Finch put her hand to her forehead, and Miss Marple saw with sharp attention that the older woman's face had indeed taken on a heightened colour. Her breathing seemed slightly laboured. "I'm perfectly," Miss Finch began, but her words trailed off. She blinked several times as though trying to clear her vision. "Perhaps you should rest a moment," Mrs. Hawtrey suggested, her comfortable face creased with concern. "You do look rather unwell." Miss Finch shook her head, a gesture that seemed to cost her some effort. No, I must finish." Her hand groped toward her embroidery hoop, but the movement was uncoordinated, lacking her usual precision. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose quietly from her chair. She had seen illness take many forms over her long life, and something in the quality of Miss Finch's distress struck her as unusual. There was a peculiar glassiness to the woman's eyes, a certain rigidity developing in her posture. "I think we should summon Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said with quiet authority. "Oh, surely that's not necessary," Mrs. Bright said quickly. "It's probably just the warmth of the room, or perhaps something she ate at luncheon." But Miss Finch's condition was deteriorating with alarming rapidity. Her breathing had become shallow and quick. She tried to rise from her chair, one hand clutching at the arm, the other reaching out as though to steady herself on something that wasn't there. "Eleanor, Mr. Miss Brooker cried, starting forward. It happened very quickly then. Miss Finch made a small gasping sound. Her thimble, still on her finger, struck the edge of the side table with a sharp metallic clink as her hand spasmed. The thimble bounced once and then rolled across the carpet with a thin, rattling sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Miss Finch slumped forward in her chair, her body going slack. The embroidery hoop slipped from her other hand and tumbled to the floor, rolling in a lazy arc across the Persian carpet before coming to rest against the leg of the sofa. The room erupted into confusion. Miss Weatherby gave a small shriek. Mrs. Hawtrey rushed forward, her ample form surprisingly quick in movement. Miss Brooker stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth. Mrs. Price Ridley began issuing contradictory orders about fetching water, opening windows, and loosening clothing. Miss Marple moved with calm efficiency. She knelt beside Miss Finch's chair, placing her fingers against the woman's neck to check for a pulse. It was there, faint and irregular, but present. Miss Finch's breathing was shallow but continuing. "She's alive," Miss Marple announced clearly, cutting through the panic. "Miss Weatherby, please telephone to Haydock immediately. Tell him it's urgent. Mrs. Hawtrey, help me settle her more comfortably." As the others bustled about following her instructions, Miss Marple's eyes fell upon the embroidery hoop that had rolled across the floor. Something about it caught her attention, something not quite right. though she couldn't immediately identify what troubled her. Mrs. Bright had not moved to help. She stood where she had risen moments before, her face very pale, staring down at Miss Finch's collapsed form with an expression that Miss Marple couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but mixed with something else. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. Dr. Haydock arrived within 10 minutes, his black bag in hand and his professional manner firmly in place. He examined Miss Finch with quick efficiency while the ladies hovered anxiously nearby. "Stroke, most likely," he pronounced after several minutes. "She's elderly and these things do happen. I'll arrange for her to be taken to the hospital in a much Benham. Best to have her under proper observation." The room filled with the murmured exclamations that such pronouncements inevitably produce. Poor Eleanor. So sudden. She seemed perfectly well just moments ago. Miss Marple said nothing. She had retrieved the embroidery hoop from where it had fallen and stood examining it with her head tilted slightly to one side, her expression thoughtful. Mrs. Hawtrey appeared at her elbow. "Such a dreadful shock," she whispered. "And she was in the middle of such lovely work. Those violets were coming along beautifully." "Yes," Miss Marple said slowly, "the violets." But the embroidery stretched across the hoop was not violets at all. Miss Marple stared at the pattern before her. It showed a house, a simple, stylized representation of a cottage with 3 windows clearly marked, rendered in various coloured threads. The design was partially complete, worked in what appeared to be several different hands, given the varying tension of the stitches. She looked across to where Miss Finch lay, now being carefully settled onto a makeshift stretcher by Dr. Haydock and his assistant. Then she looked down at the embroidery hoop again. The violets Miss Finch had been working on, the row of violets she had shown the circle earlier, the familiar pattern she had described as soothing, were nowhere to be seen. This cottage design was something else entirely, something Miss Finch had never mentioned, something that had somehow taken the place of her violet pattern. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on the wooden hoop. In the village of St. Mary Mead, she had learned that coincidences were rare and patterns were significant. A woman collapsed, an embroidery switched, a thimble dropped. And in the confusion of assistance and concern, no one had noticed, no one except Miss Marple, that Mrs. Bright had very quietly moved to stand beside the fireplace, where a work basket that was not her own sat slightly open, displaying a glimpse of purple and green silk threads. The violets, Miss Marple thought, had gone somewhere. The question was where, and more importantly, why. Dr. Haydock's voice broke through her thoughts. "We'll take her now. I'll send word of her condition once she's settled." As they carried Miss Finch out, her form small and still beneath the blanket, Miss Marple remained standing by the window, the mysterious embroidery hoop still in her hands. The afternoon light had begun to fade, and shadows were gathering in the corners of Miss Brooker's sitting room. One other thing had caught her attention, a small detail that no one else appeared to have noticed. There, near the fireplace where Mrs. Bright had stood, lay a single loose thread on the carpet. Miss Marple bent and picked it up with careful fingers. It was navy blue, a deep dark navy that caught the fading light. She folded it carefully into her handkerchief and tucked it into her bag. Then she looked once more at the cottage embroidery, at its 3 precisely marked windows, and wondered what story this switched pattern was trying to tell. Chapter 3, The Pattern That Wasn't Heard. The sewing circle had dispersed in a flurry of shocked exclamations and concerned murmurs, each lady departing with promises to call upon Miss Finch's niece and to keep the poor woman in their prayers. Miss Marple had remained behind at Miss Brooker's cottage, ostensibly to help restore order to the disrupted sitting room, but in reality to examine more carefully the peculiar circumstances of the afternoon. Miss Brooker sat in her chair, a handkerchief pressed to her lips, her thin frame trembling slightly. "I can't quite take it in," she said for perhaps the 4th time. Eleanor seemed perfectly well when she arrived. A little tired, perhaps, but nothing to suggest. "These things do happen suddenly," Miss Marple said gently, though her eyes continued to move about the room, noting the positions of teacups, the arrangement of work baskets, the small details that others might overlook. Dr. Haydock seemed quite certain in his diagnosis. "A stroke," Miss Brooker repeated, as though testing the word. "She's 70, of course, but she's always been so vigorous, so sharp. It seems impossible that she should just collapse like that." Miss Marple made a small sound of agreement. She was holding the embroidery hoop still, turning it slowly in her hands, examining the cottage pattern from various angles. The design showed a simple dwelling with 3 windows clearly marked, 2 on what appeared to be the ground floor, 1 above. The stitching was competent but not exceptional, worked in several colours including cream, brown and that distinctive navy blue. "Miss Brooker," she said thoughtfully, "had you seen Eleanor working on this particular pattern before today?" Their hostess looked up, her reddened eyes focusing with difficulty on the hoop. "The cottage? No, I don't believe so. Eleanor's been working on those violets for weeks now. She brought them every Thursday, always making steady progress. She was quite devoted to that particular piece, and yet this is what fell from her hands when she collapsed." Miss Brooker rose and came to examine the embroidery more closely, her brow furrowed with confusion. "But that's most peculiar. I saw her take out the violet pattern when she arrived. I'm quite certain of it. She arranged her silks in that methodical way she has, and I distinctly remember thinking how the purple threads caught the light." "You saw the violets," Miss Marple confirmed. "And I too noticed them when Mrs. Hawtrey commented on Eleanor's work. She was stitching purple petals. I observed her needle moving through the fabric." She paused, considering. "Which means that at some point during the afternoon this cottage pattern replaced the violet design in her hoop." The implication hung in the air between them. Miss Brooker sank back into her chair, her face very pale. "But who would do such a thing, and why? It makes no sense at all." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She was examining the threads used in the cottage pattern, noting their quality and colour. The navy blue was particularly striking, a deep, rich shade that stood out against the lighter colours. She thought of the loose thread she had found near the fireplace, now safely tucked in her handkerchief. "May I examine Eleanor's work basket?" she asked. "The one she brought with her today?" Miss Brooker gestured toward the chair where Miss Finch had sat. The basket remained there, a simple woven affair with a faded lining. Miss Marple opened it carefully, inventorying the contents with methodical attention. There were several skeins of silk thread, purple, green, white, a soft pink. There were needles of various sizes, arranged in a needle case with careful precision. There was a small pair of embroidery scissors, their handles worn smooth with use. There was a thimble case, empty now since its occupant had fallen, and rolled across the carpet during Miss Finch's collapse. What there was not, Miss Marple noted with interest, was any navy blue thread. She held up the basket to the light, examining it from several angles. "Miss Brooker, do you keep embroidery supplies yourself? Things that the Circle members might borrow if they found themselves short of a particular colour?" "Oh yes, I have quite a collection. My aunt was an avid needlewoman, and I inherited all her materials. They're kept in the seenet by the fireplace." Miss Brooker's voice suddenly sharpened. "You don't think someone used my threads to create that cottage pattern?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that it would be instructive to see what threads you have available." The cabinet proved to contain an extensive collection indeed. Dozens of skeins and spools in every imaginable colour, organised with the sort of compulsive neatness that suggested their owner valued order highly. Miss Marple's fingers moved through them with practised efficiency until she found what she was looking for. Navy blue thread, identical in shade to that used in the cottage embroidery, and the skein, she noted, had been recently used. The end was loose, and several inches had clearly been drawn off. "When did you last use this particular colour?" Miss Marple inquired. Miss Brooker shook her head. "I haven't touched the navy in months, possibly longer. I've been working on a piece in autumn shades, golds and russets. I've no current need for navy." Miss Marple replaced the thread carefully and closed the cabinet. She returned to her examination of the cottage embroidery, this time focusing on the stitching itself rather than merely the pattern. The work showed several distinct styles. Some stitches were tight and even, others slightly looser, and in one section the tension was notably different from the rest. This was not all worked by the same hand, she observed. See here, where the navy thread outlines the upper window. The stitches are larger and less precise than the rest, almost as though someone added them, hastily, without the care they gave to the other elements. She thought of Miss Finch's methodical nature, her years of teaching precision and discipline to young girls. The hasty navy stitches did not seem consistent with such a character, unless, of course, Miss Finch had been working under some form of duress or urgency. Miss Marple moved to the fireplace where she had found the loose navy thread. The carpet here showed the faint impressions of recent foot traffic. Someone had stood in this spot for some period of time. She could see where the pile was slightly compressed, suggesting the weight of a person who had remained relatively stationary. "Who was sitting or standing near the fireplace this afternoon?" she asked. Miss Brooker frowned, trying to reconstruct the arrangement. "Well, Mrs. Bright moved there at one point. She'd been on the sofa, but she got up when Eleanor mentioned something about boundaries and surveys. She stood by the mantelpiece for quite some time before Eleanor collapsed." Mrs. Bright. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. The woman who had watched Miss Finch with such intensity, the woman whose property had been mentioned in connection with boundary disputes, the woman who had stood into the very spot where a work basket, not her own, had contained violet-coloured threads. "Miss Brooker," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you might tell me exactly what you observed this afternoon. Not merely what happened, but what you noticed. The small details that seemed insignificant at the time." Miss Brooker twisted her handkerchief between her fingers. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean," Miss Marple said, settling herself in her chair, "that you've been deeply anxious throughout the afternoon. You interrupted Mrs. Hawtrey when she began to speak about seeing Eleanor in the churchyard. You were watching the garden path before Eleanor arrived, as though you anticipated something, and you poured Eleanor's second cup of tea with hands that trembled noticeably. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Brooker's face had lost what little colour it retained. "I don't know what you're suggesting," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm not suggesting anything," Miss Marple replied, with perfect truthfulness. "I'm merely observing. And what I observe is that something has been troubling you, something connected to Eleanor Finch and quite possibly to Mrs. Bright as well. I wonder if you might not feel better for sharing that burden." Miss Brooker looked at her work-worn hands, the sitting room that had witnessed such disturbing events, at the window where the late afternoon light was fading into dusk. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Eleanor came to see me 3 days ago. She was very agitated, very unlike her usual composed self. She said she had discovered something important, something that would right an old wrong. She wouldn't tell me exactly what, but she said it concerned property boundaries and deliberate deception. She said she was documenting everything carefully, that she wanted to have absolute proof before she made any accusations." "And did she mention any names?" Miss Brooker hesitated, then nodded miserably. "She mentioned Mrs. Bright. She said Amelia Bright had profited for years from a boundary that was never legitimate, that she'd extended her property at someone else's expense and covered it up cleverly. Eleanor said she was going to expose it at the next parish meeting." Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. It explained much, the tensions between the two women, Mrs. Bright's watchfulness, Miss Finch's cryptic comments about his truth emerging through unexpected channels. "And the embroidery?" she prompted. "Eleanor said she was creating something that would make the proof visible to everyone. She said that sometimes the truth needed to be shown as well as told, that she was stitching a map of sorts. I didn't entirely understand what she meant, but she seemed quite determined." A map of sorts. Miss Marple looked again at the cottage pattern with its 3 precisely marked windows. Perhaps not merely a cottage then, but a representation of a specific property. A diagram rendered in thread and fabric. "This cottage," she said, indicating the embroidery. Do you recognise it? Could it represent a particular building in St. Mary Mead? Miss Brooker studied it carefully. It might be the old Henderson cottage, the one that backs onto Mrs. Bright's property, the one that's just been sold. It has that same arrangement of windows, now that I look at it properly. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves in Miss Marple's mind like the squares of a patchwork quilt. A boundary dispute, a property extension, an embroidered map that might serve as evidence, and a woman who collapsed conveniently before she could complete or display her work. She looked down at the cottage pattern once more, at the navy blue thread that outlined sections with emphatic clarity. That thread, she thought, told its own story, but only if one knew how to read it. "I should like to keep this embroidery for the present," Miss Marple said. "With your permission, of course. I believe it may prove to be rather important." Miss Brooker nodded mutely. She looked exhausted, drained by confession and shock. Miss Marple gathered her things, her knitting, her bag, and the embroidery hoop with its mysterious cottage. As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "One more thing, Miss Brooker. The violet pattern that Eleanor was working on. Her usual familiar piece. Did you happen to notice where it went?" Miss Brooker shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. In all the confusion, I never thought to look. It simply disappeared." Yes, Miss Marple thought as she walked home through the gathering dusk. It disappeared. Just as evidence sometimes did when someone found it inconvenient, but thread, like truth, had a way of leaving traces behind. Chapter 4, Mrs. Hawtrey's Interrupted Story. The following afternoon found Miss Marple taking tea with Mrs. Hawtrey in that lady's comfortable sitting room, which overlooked a garden that bore all the signs of enthusiastic but haphazard cultivation. The conversation had naturally turned to the shocking events of the previous day, as Miss Marple had known it would. Mrs. Hawtrey was the sort of woman who derived considerable satisfaction from discussing local occurrences, though her gossip was generally of the kindly concerned variety, rather than malicious. "I've had no news from the hospital," Mrs. Hawtrey said, pouring tea with a liberal hand. "Dr. Haydock said he'd send word, but I suppose these things take time. Poor Eleanor. To think she was sitting right there among us, working away at her embroidery, and then just to collapse like that." She shook her head sorrowfully. "Though I must say, Miss Marple, there was something odd about the whole business." "Odd?" Miss Marple inquired mildly, accepting her cup. "Well, that embroidery for one thing. I could have sworn Eleanor was working on violets. I remember quite distinctly commenting on how even her stitches were. But when her hoop fell, it was that cottage pattern. I can't make sense of it at all." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "she had brought both pieces, and somehow they became confused." Mrs. Hawtrey considered this, her comfortable face creased in thought. "I suppose that's possible, though it doesn't seem very like Eleanor. She was always so methodical about everything. When she was headmistress at the school, the girls used to say you could set your watch by her routines." She paused, adding sugar to her tea. "Of course, people do become forgetful with age, though 70 isn't terribly old these days, and Eleanor's always been sharp as a tack." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound and sipped her tea. She had brought her knitting, and her needles began their steady rhythm as the conversation continued. "You know," Mrs. Hawtrey said, leaning forward slightly, "I was trying to mention something yesterday, just before Eleanor collapsed, about seeing her earlier in the week, but Miss Brooker interrupted me rather sharply, and then everything happened so quickly that the opportunity was lost." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's needles did not pause, but her attention sharpened considerably. "You had seen Eleanor recently, then?" "Yes, on Tuesday afternoon. I'd gone to the churchyard to put fresh flowers on my mother-in-law's grave. I try to go weekly, though I confess I sometimes let it slip, and I saw Eleanor near the old section by the yew trees. She was talking to someone, and they seemed to be having quite an intense discussion." Miss Marple counted her stitches before responding. "How interesting. Could you see who she was speaking with?" Mrs. Hawtrey hesitated, her natural inclination toward discretion warring with her desire to share information. "Well, I couldn't see clearly at first, They were partly obscured by the yew trees, and I was some distance away, but as I was leaving I caught a glimpse of— The sitting-room door opened, and Mrs. Hawtrey's housemaid appeared. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Mrs. Bright is here to see you. Shall I show her in?" The effect of this announcement was remarkable. Mrs. Hawtrey's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, and a flush rose in her cheeks. She glanced at Miss Marple with an expression that mingled guilt and apprehension. "Oh, yes, of course. Show her in, Mary." Mrs. Bright entered with her customary air of assured elegance. She was dressed in a smart afternoon ensemble of dark green, and her manner was cordial, though Miss Marple detected a certain tension beneath the polished surface. "Mrs. Hawtrey, how kind of you to receive me without notice. Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise." Her smile included them both, but her eyes were watchful. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Mrs. Hawtrey said, though her discomfort was evident. "We were just having tea and discussing yesterday's dreadful events. Won't you join us?" "How thoughtful!" Mrs. Bright settled herself in a chair, positioned so that she could observe both of them easily. "That's partly why I've come, actually. I've been to see Eleanor's niece, Mrs. Vernon, to offer my assistance during this difficult time. The poor woman is quite distraught." "That was kind of you," Miss Marple said gently. "Have you had any news of Miss Finch's condition?" "She remains unconscious, I'm afraid. Dr. Haydock is pessimistic about her prospects for recovery. A severe stroke, apparently." Mrs. Bright accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Hawtrey. "It's a reminder of how fragile life can be. One moment engaged in pleasant society, the next moment struck down." There was a brief silence. Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic clicking, and she appeared absorbed in her knitting, but she was acutely aware of the atmosphere in the room. Mrs. Hawtrey seemed unable to meet Mrs. Bright's eyes, busying herself with the tea things unnecessarily. Mrs. Bright, for her part, maintained her composed demeanour, but there was something rigid in the set of her shoulders. "I couldn't help overhearing," Mrs. Bright said after a moment, her tone light but her gaze direct, "that you were discussing having seen Eleanor earlier this week, Mrs. Hawtrey, in the churchyard, I believe you said." Mrs. Hawtrey's flush deepened. "Oh, that? Yes, I happened to be there on Tuesday, putting flowers on my mother-in-law's grave. I do it every week, you know, or I try to, though sometimes." "And you saw Eleanor there?" Mrs. Bright prompted, her interruption smoothly executed. "Well, yes, she was near the yew trees, having a conversation with someone. I didn't like to intrude, naturally, so I didn't approach." "How discreet of you." Mrs. Bright's smile did not quite reach her eyes. The churchyard is a peaceful spot for a private conversation. One wouldn't want to be observed or overheard in such circumstances. The implication hung in the air. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with an expression of mild interest. "I've always thought," she said pleasantly, "that churchyards have a way of prompting serious discussions. There's something about being surrounded by reminders of mortality that encourages people to address matters they might otherwise avoid. In St. Mary Mead, some of the most honest conversations I've witnessed have taken place among the gravestones." Mrs. Bright's attention shifted to her, and Miss Marple met her gaze with her customary gentle steadiness. "You're quite right, of course," Mrs. Bright said after a moment, "though I imagine such conversations are generally of a spiritual or philosophical nature. Reflections on life and death, that sort of thing." "Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed, "though sometimes they concern more practical matters. Property disputes, for instance, or questions of rightful ownership. I recall a situation some years ago involving two families who met in the churchyard to discuss a boundary disagreement. The neutral ground, as it were, seemed appropriate for attempting to resolve the matter." Mrs. Hawtrey had gone very still, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. Mrs. Bright's expression remained carefully neutral, but her fingers tightened slightly on her own cup. "How fascinating," Mrs. Bright said. "And was the matter resolved?" "Eventually," Miss Marple replied, "though not through discussion, I'm afraid. One of the parties produced documentary evidence, old surveys and property maps, that proved the true boundaries beyond dispute. It's remarkable how historical records can clarify matters that seemed hopelessly confused. Yes, Mrs. Bright said slowly. Remarkable indeed. Though of course old records can sometimes be misleading. Maps drawn decades ago may not reflect subsequent legitimate adjustments. True, Miss Marple acknowledged. Unless, of course, there's a clear record of such adjustments being properly registered and approved. In their absence, the original documentation tends to carry considerable weight. The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Hawtrey setting down her cup with an audible clink. "More tea, anyone?" she asked with forced brightness. Mrs. Bright declined, rising with smooth grace. "I'm afraid I must be going. I have several other calls to make. It's important, don't you think, to maintain community connections during difficult times, to ensure that everyone understands the situation correctly and doesn't give credence to unfounded speculation or rumour." "Very important," Miss Marple agreed, "though I've always found that truth has a way of emerging regardless of speculation or rumour. Facts are remarkably persistent things." Mrs. Bright's smile was tight. Indeed, though facts require proper interpretation, and that interpretation is best left to those with complete information rather than partial glimpses of situations they don't fully understand. She took her leave with appropriate courtesies, but the air of warning she left behind was unmistakable. Mrs. Hawtrey remained silent until the front door closed, then released a breath she seemed to have been holding. "Oh dear," she said faintly. "I do hope I haven't caused trouble." Mrs. Bright seemed rather pointed in her remarks. "She did indeed," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "which suggests that your observation in the churchyard touches on something she finds significant. You were about to tell me, I believe, whom you saw Eleanor speaking with on Tuesday." Mrs. Hawtrey glanced nervously toward the door, as though Mrs. Bright might reappear. "I caught a glimpse as I was leaving. It was Mrs. Bright herself. They were standing quite close together, and Eleanor appeared to be showing her something. Papers of some kind, I think. Mrs. Bright's face was very red, and her expression was—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Angry. No, more than angry. Frightened, perhaps. Or both." Miss Marple's needles had stopped their movement. "Papers," she repeated softly. "Yes, several sheets it looked like." Eleanor was pointing to something on them, speaking quite emphatically. I couldn't hear what was being said, of course, but the gestures were clear enough. Mrs. Bright kept shaking her head, but Eleanor seemed quite insistent. And then Mrs. Bright said something. I could hear her voice rising, though not the words, and Eleanor simply folded the papers, put them in her bag, and walked away. And Mrs. Bright? She stood there for several minutes, absolutely still, staring after Eleanor. Then she left as well, going in the opposite direction. I'd never seen her look so shaken. It quite unsettled me. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression thoughtful. Papers that Eleanor had shown to Mrs. Bright. Papers that had prompted anger and fear. Papers that Eleanor had been documenting, according to Miss Brooker, as proof of property fraud. "Mrs. Hawtrey," she said quietly, "I think it would be wise not to mention this conversation to anyone else just yet. Not until we know more about Eleanor's condition and the circumstances surrounding her collapse." Mrs. Hawtrey nodded vigorously. "I quite agree. In fact, I wish I'd never seen anything at all. These matters are so uncomfortable, and I do dislike any sort of unpleasantness." Miss Marple understood perfectly. Most people did dislike unpleasantness. It was why so many wrongs went unchallenged and so many truths remained unspoken. But Eleanor Finch, it seemed, had not been one to avoid unpleasantness when principle was at stake. And now Eleanor Finch lay unconscious in a hospital bed, and the papers she had shown to Mrs. Bright were nowhere to be found. Chapter 5: The Needle with the Crooked Eye. Miss Marple had spent much of Friday morning in her garden, ostensibly attending to the late roses, but in reality thinking carefully about the events of the past 2 days. The embroidery hoop with its cottage pattern sat on her sitting-room table, and she'd examined it thoroughly by morning light, noting details that had escaped her initial observation. The navy thread, the varying tension of stitches, the precise placement of the 3 windows, all suggested a deliberate attempt to record information in textile form. It was just after 11 when her maid, Clara, appeared at the garden gate. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Mrs. Vernon has called. Miss Finch's niece. She's asking if you might spare her a few moments." Miss Marple removed her gardening gloves. "Of course. Please show her into the sitting-room, Clara, and bring tea." Mrs. Vernon was a pleasant-faced woman in her middle 40s, with the same upright carriage and clear gaze that had characterised her aunt. She accepted Miss Marple's condolences with quiet dignity, though her eyes were reddened from crying. "The hospital says there's no change," she said after they had settled with their tea. "The doctors say we must simply wait and hope. But I confess I'm not optimistic. Aunt Eleanor's 70 and strokes at that age." She left the thought unfinished. "I'm very sorry," Miss Marple said with genuine sympathy. "Your aunt struck me as a woman of considerable strength and principle." She is," Mrs. Vernon corrected herself firmly, as though refusing to speak of her aunt in the past tense. "Which is partly why I've come to you, Miss Marple. Miss Brooker mentioned that you were present when Aunt Eleanor collapsed, and that you've been asking questions about the circumstances. I wonder if you might tell me honestly, do you think my aunt's collapse was entirely natural?" Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "What makes you ask that question, Mrs. Vernon?" "Because my aunt came to see me on Monday evening and she was worried. She said she'd discovered something important, something that concerned property fraud and deception. She said she was documenting everything carefully because she expected resistance, possibly even hostility, when she made the matter public. She asked me to keep her papers safe if anything happened to her." "And did you agree?" Mrs. Vernon shook her head ruefully. "I tried to discourage her. I said she was being melodramatic, that this was St. Mary Mead, not some Gothic novel. She just smiled in that way she had and said that human nature was much the same whether one lived in a village or a city. Greed and fear made people do desperate things." She paused, twisting her handkerchief. "I wish now I'd taken her more seriously. These papers she mentioned, do you have them?" "No. She said she'd bring them to me after the sewing circle meeting on Thursday. She wanted to complete one more piece of documentation first, something that would make the evidence visually clear to everyone. I assumed she meant a diagram or map of some kind, though she was quite mysterious about the details." "A map of some kind." Miss Marple thought of the embroidered cottage with its precisely placed windows. Perhaps Eleanor Finch's stitchwork had been exactly that, a map rendered in thread, showing boundaries as they truly were rather than as someone had fraudulently altered them. "Mrs. Vernon," she said gently, "I wonder if I might ask a rather unusual favour. Would you permit me to examine your aunt's sewing kit, the one she brought to the circle on Thursday?" Mrs. Vernon looked surprised, but nodded. "Of course, Miss Brooker returned it to me yesterday evening, along with Aunt Eleanor's other belongings from the cottage. I'll fetch it." She returned moments later with the familiar woven basket. Miss Marple opened it and began examining the contents systematically, laying each item on the table, the skeins of purple, green, white and pink thread, the needle case, the embroidery scissors, the empty thimble case. The needle case was a simple leather folder with loops to hold needles of various sizes. Miss Marple removed them one by one, examining each with careful attention. Most were straight and true, their eyes properly formed for threading. But the 4th needle she examined made her pause. It was bent, not dramatically, but noticeably, with a distinct curve about halfway down its length. More significantly, the eye of the needle was misshapen, pulled slightly out of alignment, as though the needle had been forced through material that resisted its passage. "How odd," Mrs. Vernon said, leaning closer. "Aunt Eleanor was always so particular about her tools. She would never have continued using a damaged needle." "No," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, "she wouldn't, which suggests that this needle was damaged recently, possibly during her last piece of work." She held it up to the light, examining the eye more closely. Caught in the distorted metal was a single fibre, not silk thread, but something coarser and heavier. "What kind of material would bend a needle like this?" Mrs. Vernon asked. Miss Marple considered. Something substantial, not embroidery linen, certainly. Perhaps canvas or heavy cotton, or... She paused, her mind working through possibilities. Or multiple layers of fabric stitched together. If one were creating something that needed to be durable rather than decorative, one might use heavier material and sew through several thicknesses at once. She thought of the papers Eleanor had been documenting. Papers that needed to be kept safe, perhaps even hidden. What better way to protect important documents than to wrap them in fabric sewn securely closed? "Mrs. Vernon, did your aunt do any practical sewing? Mending? Making bags or cases? That sort of thing?" "Oh yes, she was quite skilled at all forms of needlework. She made me a lovely document case just last month. Stick, worked from heavy linen with a secure closure. She said it was useful for keeping important papers organised and protected." "And the colour of this linen?" Mrs. Vernon thought for a moment. "Cream, I believe. A natural undyed fabric." Miss Marple carefully replaced the bent needle in its case. The pieces were beginning to fit together in her mind. Eleanor Finch, discovering evidence of property fraud, would have wanted to protect that evidence. She would have documented it carefully, perhaps making copies or creating visual representations, and she would have hidden it somewhere safe, quite possibly in a sewn fabric case that would attract no particular attention. The cottage embroidery with its 3 windows might have been one form of documentation, a stitched map showing the true boundaries. But there would have been papers as well, the original surveys and records that provided legal proof. Those papers would need to be kept secure, and Eleanor Finch was exactly the sort of methodical person who would create a proper case for them. A case that would require heavy thread and needles strong enough to penetrate multiple layers of fabric, a case that might bend a needle if one were working quickly, urgently, trying to complete it before a crucial meeting. "Mrs. Vernon," Miss Marple said, "I believe your aunt created some form of document case or portfolio shortly before the sewing circle meeting. She may have been planning to bring the papers to you immediately afterward, as you said, but she wanted them properly secured first. The bent needle suggests she was working on something substantial, something that required sewing through thick material." "But where is this case now? It wasn't in her basket." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It wasn't. Which suggests that either your aunt hid it somewhere before the meeting, or it was taken from her." Mrs. Vernon's face had gone pale. "You think someone stole it? But who would—" She stopped, understanding dawning. "The person who committed the fraud. The person Aunt Eleanor was planning to expose." Miss Marple said nothing, but her silence was eloquent. She was thinking of Mrs. Bright's watchful intensity during the sewing circle, of her position by the fireplace where Eleanor's violet embroidery had somehow ended up, of her sharp interruption when Mrs. Hawtrey began to speak of the churchyard meeting. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Vernon said quietly, "do you think my aunt's collapse was really a stroke?" It was the question Miss Marple had been asking herself since Thursday afternoon. Dr. Haydock had seemed certain in his diagnosis, but Dr. Haydock had not noticed the switched embroidery or the missing violet pattern. He had not known about property fraud or threatening documents. He had seen an elderly woman collapse and had drawn the obvious medical conclusion. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the obvious conclusion was not always the correct one. She had seen in her years of quiet observation how people could mask murder with the appearance of natural death, how a cup of tea might contain more than just tea, how a convenient illness might be rather less than convenient for the victim. "I think," she said carefully, "that it would be wise to discover what your aunt was working on in the days before her collapse. If we can find this document case, if we can locate the papers she mentioned, then we may better understand what happened on Thursday afternoon." Mrs. Vernon nodded slowly. "Then we must search Aunt Eleanor's cottage. If she hid something, that's the most likely place. Will you come with me, Miss Marple? I confess I'd value your insight." Miss Marple rose, collecting her bag and gloves. "I should be honoured to help. Sometimes, she added, thinking of the bent needle with its telltale fibre, the smallest objects tell the largest stories. Your aunt understood that, I think. She was documenting truth in every way she could. In papers, in embroidery, in carefully sewn cases. We must simply find what she left behind. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple glanced once more at the needle case lying open on her table. The bent needle seemed to gleam in the morning light, its crooked eye bearing witness to urgent work and hidden purposes. Truth, Eleanor Finch had believed, deserved protection. The question now was whether that protection had been sufficient, and whether the truth could be recovered before it was lost forever. Chapter 6. The Visitor Asking After Thread. Eleanor Finch's cottage stood at the end of a quiet lane, a modest dwelling of weathered brick with a small, well-tended garden. Mrs. Vernon unlocked the front door with a key that trembled slightly in her fingers, and they entered the hallway with its familiar smell of lavender and beeswax polish. Aunt Eleanor was very particular about keeping things in order, Mrs. Vernon said, leading Miss Marple into the sitting room. If she hid something, it would be hidden properly, but logically. She wasn't one for random concealment. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving about the room with practised observation. It was the sitting room of a woman who valued neatness and tradition. A few good pieces of furniture, well maintained, family photographs in silver frames, books arranged by the subject on the shelves. A sewing basket sat beside the armchair near the window, and Miss Marple moved toward it naturally. "This isn't the basket she took to the sewing circle," she observed. No, she had two, one for travelling and one for home use. The home basket contained her larger projects and extra supplies. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside were several pieces of work in various stages of completion. A tablecloth with drawn threadwork, a set of napkins awaiting monograms, and beneath these, wrapped in tissue paper, another embroidery hoop. She lifted it out carefully and removed the tissue. The hoop contained a partially completed row of violets, worked in purple and green silk on cream linen, precisely the pattern Eleanor Finch had been stitching at the sewing circle before it had mysteriously disappeared. "The violets," Mrs. Vernon said softly. "This is the piece she was actually working on." "Yes, and someone went to considerable trouble to replace it with the cottage pattern." Miss Marple examined the stitching closely. The work was exquisite, each petal precisely shaded, each leaf carefully shaped. This was Eleanor Finch's true work, methodical, beautiful, and incomplete. She was about to set it aside when something caught her attention. The linen around the edges of the hoop, where it would be covered by the frame, showed faint pencil marks. Miss Marple loosened the hoop and spread the fabric flat on the table. The pencil marks formed letters, small, neat annotations in what appeared to be measurements and dates. "End boundary, 1847 survey," read one notation. "Extension, 1923, no record," read another. Eleanor Finch had been using even this decorative piece as a form of documentation, hiding evidence in plain sight among the violets. She was extraordinarily thorough, Miss Marple murmured. Even her ordinary needlework carried information. They continued their search, but the cottage yielded no document case, no wrapped papers, no sewn portfolio of the kind Miss Marple had theorised. After an hour of careful examination, they sat in Eleanor's sitting room with tea that Mrs. Vernon had prepared, contemplating their lack of success. "Perhaps she kept the papers elsewhere," Mrs. Vernon suggested. "At the bank or with her solicitor." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, though she didn't think so. Eleanor Finch had intended to bring the papers to her niece after the sewing circle meeting. They would have been close at hand, ready for collection, unless, of course, someone had already taken them. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Vernon went to answer it, and returned with a young woman whom Miss Marple recognised as Sarah Collins, the daughter of the proprietor of the village haberdashery. "I'm so sorry to intrude, Mrs. Vernon," Sarah said, twisting her hands nervously. "I heard in the village that Miss Finch had been taken ill, and I wanted to— that is, I thought I should mention something that happened on Tuesday. It seemed odd at the time, and now with Miss Finch in the hospital, I wondered if it might be important." "Please, sit down," Mrs. Vernon said. "This is Miss Marple. You can speak freely." Sarah perched on the edge of a chair, her young face earnest. It was Tuesday afternoon, just before closing time. A woman came into the shop asking for thread. She was very specific about the colour, navy blue, a particular deep shade. She had a small snippet of thread with her to match. Miss Marple's attention sharpened considerably in the thought of the loose navy thread she had found by the fireplace, now carefully preserved in her handkerchief at home. "Did she purchase the thread?" Miss Marple asked. "No, that's the peculiar thing. We didn't have that exact shade in stock. Our navy is a bit lighter. I offered to order it for her, but she seemed quite agitated about not being able to get it immediately. She asked if there were any other shops nearby that might carry embroidery thread, and I mentioned that Miss Finch sometimes had unusual colours in her collection, as she had been a needlework teacher. The woman asked where Miss Finch lived, and I gave her directions. I didn't think anything of it at the time." "Can you describe this woman?" Miss Marple inquired. Sarah frowned in concentration. She was well dressed, middle-aged, I'd say, smart coat and hat. She spoke well, a lady definitely, but she seemed nervous, kept glancing at the door as though worried someone might come in. When I mentioned Miss Finch's name, she went quite still for a moment, then said she wouldn't bother disturbing anyone. She thanked me and left without buying anything. "What time was this?" "About 5 o'clock. We close at 5:30, and she was one of our last customers." Mrs. Vernon looked bewildered, but Miss Marple's expression had grown very thoughtful indeed. Tuesday evening was when Eleanor Finch had visited her niece, worried and asking her to keep papers safe. Tuesday afternoon was when Mrs. Hawtrey had witnessed the confrontation in the churchyard between Eleanor and Mrs. Bright. And Tuesday afternoon, shortly before 5 o'clock, someone had been to the haberdashery asking for navy thread, the same distinctive shade that had been used to work the cottage embroidery that replaced Eleanor's violets. "Miss Collins," Miss Marple said carefully, "this woman who came to your shop, if you saw her again, would you recognise her?" "Oh yes, certainly. She had rather a distinctive appearance, handsome, you might say, with very good posture. And she wore quite a lovely brooch. Antique garnets. I noticed it particularly." Mrs. Vernon's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Mrs. Bright," she said faintly. "That sounds exactly like Mrs. Bright. She has a garnet brooch she wears frequently. It was her mother's." Sarah looked distressed. "Oh dear. Have I caused trouble? I didn't mean to cast suspicions on anyone. Perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned it at all." "You did quite right to mention it," Miss Marple assured her. "Sometimes small observations prove very significant." After Sarah had departed, promising to say nothing of the conversation, Miss Marple sat quietly piecing together the sequence of events. Mrs. Bright confronted by Eleanor in the churchyard with evidence of her property fraud. Mrs. Bright going to the haberdashery to obtain specific thread, navy thread that matched something she had seen or planned. Mrs. Bright discovering that the thread wasn't readily available but learning that Eleanor Finch might have it. "But why would Mrs. Bright need navy thread?" Mrs. Vernon asked, voicing the question that hung in the air. Miss Marple thought of the cottage embroidery with its hastily worked navy outline. "I believe," she said slowly, "that Mrs. Bright saw the papers Eleanor showed her in the churchyard. Those papers may have included a diagram or map showing the true property boundaries. Mrs. Bright, realising the danger Eleanor represented, decided to complicate matters. If Eleanor had created an embroidered version of the boundary map, Mrs. Bright might have planned to alter it, to create confusion about what Eleanor had actually documented. But how could she alter Aunt Eleanor's work? By having access to it during the sewing circle. By switching it for a different piece, one that Mrs. Bright herself had worked, using thread she would have obtained from Eleanor's own supplies once she'd determined the haberdashery couldn't provide it. Miss Marple paused. The cottage pattern may have been Mrs. Bright's attempt to muddy the waters to create a false version that she could later claim was Eleanor's intended evidence, thereby discrediting the real documentation. Mrs. Vernon had gone very pale. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Bright planned all of this? That she came to Aunt Eleanor's cottage to get thread and then—" She stopped, but the implication was clear. If Mrs. Bright had visited Eleanor's cottage on Tuesday evening, she would have had opportunity to observe Eleanor's work, to learn her routines, perhaps even to tamper with her tea or her sewing, supplies in preparation for Thursday's circle. "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that navy thread was important enough for Mrs. Bright to seek it specifically. She couldn't obtain it at the shop, but she learned that your aunt might have it. And somehow that navy thread ended up in the cottage embroidery that replaced your aunt's violets. She thought of the bent needle, of the document case Eleanor must have been creating, of the violet embroidery with its hidden notations. Eleanor Finch had been methodically building a case against Mrs. Bright, documenting fraud in multiple forms, and Mrs. Bright, equally methodical in her own way, had been attempting to undermine that evidence before it could be presented. The question now was how far Mrs. Bright had been willing to go to protect her secret, and whether Eleanor Finch's collapse had been the natural event Dr. Haydock assumed, or something far more sinister. Chapter 7. The Bag Under the Window Seat. After Sarah Collins departed, Miss Marple and Mrs. Vernon sat in thoughtful silence for several moments. The afternoon light slanted through Eleanor Finch's sitting room windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. It was a peaceful scene, but Miss Marple's mind was far from peaceful. She was thinking about navy thread and switched embroidery, about bent needles and hidden documents, about a woman lying unconscious in a hospital bed. "We've searched the obvious places," Mrs. Vernon said finally, her voice weary. "The desk drawers, the sewing baskets, the cupboards. Where else might Aunt Eleanor have hidden something she considered important?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted around the room, considering. Eleanor Finch had been a methodical woman, a former headmistress accustomed to organisation and proper procedure, but she had also been worried, according to her niece, worried enough to speak of resistance and hostility. A worried person might hide things not in the obvious places, but somewhere close at hand, somewhere she could monitor easily. Her eyes fell on the window seat that ran beneath the bay window overlooking the garden. It was a charming feature, upholstered in faded chintz, with cushions arranged along its length. The sort of place where one might sit with one's sewing and enjoy the afternoon light. "The window seat," Miss Marple said quietly. "Is there storage beneath it?" Mrs. Vernon looked surprised. "Yes, there is. The seat lifts up. It's where Aunt Eleanor kept extra blankets and linens. But surely she wouldn't hide important papers among the blankets." "Perhaps not among them," Miss Marple said, rising, "but beneath them possibly. May I?" Together they moved to the window seat and lifted the cushions. Mrs. Vernon grasped the edge of the upholstered lid and raised it, revealing the storage space below. As she had said, it was filled with neatly folded blankets and bed linens, arranged with typical Eleanor Finch precision, sorted by size, colour-coordinated, everything in perfect order. Miss Marple began removing items carefully, setting them aside one by one. The blankets came out first, a winter wool, a summer cotton, a knitted afghan. Then the sheets and pillowcases, monogrammed with Eleanor's initials. And finally, tucked into the corner at the very back where one would have to reach quite far to find it, a cloth bag tied firmly with cord. "What on earth?" Mrs. Vernon murmured as Miss Marple drew it out. The bag was made of sturdy canvas, the kind used for storing heavy items or protecting delicate objects during travel. It was surprisingly bulky, suggesting substantial contents. Miss Marple carried it to the table and began working at the knots in the cord. They had been tied very securely, triple knots that would take considerable effort to undo accidentally. Aunt Eleanor was protecting something, Mrs. Vernon said, watching the careful knots being loosened. Indeed she was. The cord finally came free and Miss Marple opened the bag. Inside lay 2 items wrapped separately. The first she removed was an embroidery hoop containing the violet pattern they had already found in Eleanor's home sewing basket. But wait, Miss Marple paused. This was not the same piece. The violet embroidery in the basket had been partially complete. This piece, while similar in design, was even less finished, perhaps only a third completed. "I don't understand," Mrs. Vernon said. "We found the violet embroidery upstairs. Why would there be another one here?" Miss Marple examined both pieces carefully. The one from the sewing basket was more advanced, but showed some irregularity in the stitching as though different hands had worked on it. This piece from the bag was less complete but entirely consistent in its needlework, all of it clearly Eleanor Finch's work. "I believe," Miss Marple said slowly, "that your aunt began 2 versions of the violet pattern. The one she kept in her regular basket was for general viewing, the piece she worked on at the sewing circle where others could see it. This one, hidden away, was her true work. The notations we found on the first piece, those measurements and dates, may have been even more extensive on this version before someone attempted to obscure them." She set the embroidery aside and turned her attention to the second item in the bag, a bundle wrapped in cream-coloured linen and sewn closed along all edges. The stitching was hasty but secure, worked with heavy thread in the manner that would bend a needle forced through multiple layers. "This is what your aunt was making with the damaged needle," Miss Marple said. "A sewn case for her documents." Her fingers found a small opening where the stitching had been left incomplete, presumably where Eleanor had intended to insert or remove papers. Miss Marple carefully widened this gap and reached inside. Her fingers encountered paper, several sheets folded carefully. She withdrew them one by one and spread them on the table. Mrs. Vernon leaned forward, her breath catching as she recognised what they were seeing. The first document was an old land survey dated 1847, showing the boundaries of several properties in St. Mary Mead. The map was hand-drawn but precise, with each property clearly delineated and labelled. One section showed 2 cottages, identified as Henderson Cottage and a Bright House, with a clear boundary line between them marked with careful measurements. The second document was more recent, dated 1923. It appeared to be a property registration showing an amended boundary for Bright House. The line had been moved considerably, extending Mrs. Bright's property by what looked to be at least 15 feet into what had previously been Henderson land. The third document was a letter, written in Eleanor Finch's precise hand, detailing the history of the boundary change. She had done considerable research, consulting parish records, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the original properties, and comparing multiple survey documents. Her conclusion was damning. In 1923, following the death of the elderly Henderson couple, Mrs. Bright's late husband had quietly moved the boundary markers and registered the amended property line. The Hendersons' heir living abroad had never been informed of the change. "This is fraud," Mrs. Vernon said flatly. "Deliberate, calculated fraud spanning decades." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and your aunt had documented it thoroughly. The original 1847 survey would carry considerable legal weight, as would the lack of any proper authorization for the 23 change." She examined the linen wrapping more closely. It had been cut from a larger piece of fabric, and one edge showed a tear, not a clean cut but an irregular rip, as though something had been removed hastily. The torn section was approximately the size and shape of the cottage embroidery that had replaced Eleanor's violets at the sewing circle. "Look at this," Miss Marple said, indicating the tear. "I believe your aunt used this linen to create the cottage embroidery, the one that appeared in her hoop after she collapsed. She was making a visual representation of the Henderson cottage with its 3 windows showing the original boundary line. But if Aunt Eleanor made that embroidery, why would it have replaced her violets, and why would Mrs. Bright need navy thread?" Miss Marple was silent for a moment, studying the documents and the torn linen. The picture was becoming clearer, though some pieces remained elusive. "I believe," she said carefully, "that your aunt may have shown Mrs. Bright not only the documents but also her embroidered map during their confrontation in the churchyard. Mrs. Bright would have seen how Eleanor was documenting the fraud, in papers, in measurements, in visual form. She would have realised that Eleanor had created multiple pieces of evidence, each reinforcing the others. So Mrs. Bright wanted to confuse matters. Perhaps she wanted to alter the embroidered evidence somehow, to make it appear less damning or to claim it showed something different from what Eleanor intended. Miss Marple thought of the navy thread outlining the cottage. If Mrs. Bright could obtain the same materials Eleanor used, the same colour thread for instance, she might be able to add elements to the embroidery that would support her own version of events. Mrs. Vernon's face had gone very pale. "Miss Marple, you're suggesting that Mrs. Bright planned to steal Aunt Eleanor's evidence and alter it. But that would require access to Aunt Eleanor's work, her supplies, her—" She stopped, understanding flooding her features. The sewing circle. Mrs. Bright would have had access to everything during the meeting. Precisely. Though I believe her plans may have been even more comprehensive than simple theft and alteration. Miss Marple's expression was grave. Your aunt collapsed very suddenly, Mrs. Vernon. One moment she was speaking coherently about boundaries and truth emerging through unexpected channels. The next moment she was unconscious. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Mrs. Vernon's hand went to her throat. You think Mrs. Bright poisoned her? But how? We were all there, all watching. Not watching the tea, Miss Marple said quietly. Miss Brooker poured your aunt's second cup, but Miss Brooker was nervous and distracted. Someone standing near the tea table would have had opportunity, particularly if everyone's attention was focused elsewhere. And Mrs. Bright did move to the fireplace shortly before your aunt collapsed, the fireplace being quite near where the tea things were arranged. Mrs. Vernon sank into a chair, her face ashen. What do we do? If this is true, if Mrs. Bright deliberately harmed Aunt Eleanor, we must go to the police immediately. We must, Miss Marple agreed. But first we need to understand exactly what happened. These documents prove one motive. Mrs. Bright had every reason to want your aunt silenced. The bent needle and sewn case prove your aunt was taking precautions. The navy thread and switched embroidery prove Mrs. Bright attempted to interfere with the evidence. But we need to establish how your aunt was poisoned, if indeed she was, and we need to understand the full scope of Mrs. Bright's planning. She looked down at the documents spread across the table, at the torn linen and the hidden embroidery. Eleanor Finch had been thorough, methodical, determined to expose wrongdoing despite the risks. She had created multiple forms of evidence, hidden them carefully, and prepared to present her case publicly. But someone had been equally methodical in attempting to stop her, and that someone, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, was Amelia Bright, a woman who had profited from fraud for decades and would do whatever necessary to protect her secret. Chapter 8. The Missing Piece of Linen. Miss Marple returned home from Eleanor Finch's cottage with the documents safely in her possession, entrusted to her care by Mrs. Vernon pending consultation with the police. The linen-wrapped bundle now sat on her sitting-room table beside the cottage embroidery that had been taken from Miss Brooker's rooms, and she studied both with the careful attention she might give to a particularly complex piece of knitting. The cottage embroidery showed 3 windows rendered in cream, brown, and that distinctive navy blue thread. The design was simple but specific, not merely any cottage, but a particular dwelling with identifiable features. The navy thread had been used to outline certain sections with emphatic clarity, as though marking something of special significance. The torn linen from Eleanor's hidden bundle was cream-coloured, heavy, and showed evidence of having been cut deliberately to a specific size. But one edge, the edge that interested Miss Marple most, had been torn rather than cut. The tear was fresh, the fibres still slightly raised where they had been pulled apart. She laid the embroidered cottage pattern on the table and carefully positioned the torn linen beside it, aligning the edges. Even without perfect fitting, the relationship was clear. The tear in the linen matched almost exactly the dimensions of the embroidered cottage. This linen had originally been wrapped around Eleanor's documents, and a portion of it had been removed, cut away on 3 sides, torn on the 4th, to create the fabric on which the cottage had been stitched. But why would Eleanor Finch tear a piece from her document wrapping? And more significantly, when had she done so? Miss Marple rose and retrieved the violet embroidery they had found in Eleanor's home basket, the one with the penciled notations along the edges. She examined it once more in the better light of her sitting room, noting the measurements and dates that Eleanor had carefully recorded. The handwriting was steady, precise, the work of someone operating without particular urgency. The cottage embroidery told a different story. When Miss Marple examined the stitching under her magnifying glass, she could see variations in tension that suggested haste. Some stitches were slightly uneven, pulled tighter than others. The navy thread in particular showed signs of quick work. The outlines were confident but lacked the meticulous care evident in Eleanor's violet pattern. She was working quickly, Miss Marple murmured to herself, creating this piece under pressure, perhaps in response to something that had happened. She thought back to the timeline of events. Eleanor had confronted Mrs. Bright in the churchyard on Tuesday, showing her the documents. That evening Eleanor had visited her niece, worried and asking Mrs. Vernon to keep papers safe. On Wednesday, what had happened on Wednesday and on Thursday morning before the sewing circle, had Eleanor been doing something significant? Miss Marple reached for her telephone and asked the operator to connect her to Mrs. Vernon. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said when Mrs. Vernon answered, "but I have a question about your aunt's habits. Did she typically work on her embroidery in the mornings, or was that something she reserved for afternoons?" "Mornings usually," Mrs. Vernon replied. She liked to have the best natural light for close work. She'd sit by her window with her sewing from about 9 until noon, then take a break for luncheon. Why do you ask? Did anyone visit her on Wednesday or Thursday morning? A neighbour, perhaps? Or a delivery person? There was a pause while Mrs. Vernon considered. "I'm not certain about Wednesday, but I know Mrs. Bright called on her Thursday morning. I remember because my daily woman, Mrs. Todd, mentioned it. She does for both Aunt Eleanor and Mrs. Bright, you see. Different days. She told me Mrs. Bright had arrived at Aunt Eleanor's cottage around 10 o'clock, stayed perhaps 20 minutes, and left looking quite flushed and agitated." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the telephone receiver. "Mrs. Bright visited your aunt on Thursday morning, just hours before the sewing circle meeting?" "Yes. Mrs. Todd thought it odd because Mrs. Bright and Aunt Eleanor weren't particularly close. She heard raised voices at one point, though she couldn't make out the words." After thanking Mrs. Vernon and ringing off, Miss Marple sat very still, allowing the pieces to arrange themselves in her mind. Mrs. Bright, having been confronted in the churchyard with evidence of her fraud, would have spent Tuesday night and Wednesday in a state of considerable anxiety. She had attempted to obtain navy thread from the haberdashery, learning instead that Eleanor might have such thread in her supplies. On Thursday morning, Mrs. Bright had visited Eleanor's cottage. Why? Perhaps to plead, to threaten, to attempt negotiation. But also, and Miss Marple felt increasingly certain of this, to observe, to see what Eleanor had prepared, what evidence existed, how that evidence was being documented. Mrs. Bright would have seen the violet embroidery with its hidden notations. She might have glimpsed the linen-wrapped documents in Eleanor's work area, and she would have realised that Eleanor intended to bring all of this evidence to the sewing circle meeting or shortly thereafter to make it public. That Thursday morning visit would have been Mrs. Bright's opportunity to understand exactly what she was facing and to plan her response. If she had been observant, and everything suggested Mrs. Bright was highly observant, she would have noted Eleanor's materials, her methods, her organisational habits. Miss Marple picked up the cottage embroidery once more, examining it with this new understanding. The stitching was Eleanor's work. She was certain of that, but it had been created hastily, perhaps even fearfully. After Mrs. Bright's Thursday morning visit, Eleanor might have realised her evidence needed additional protection or additional forms of documentation. The torn linen suggested urgency. Eleanor had ripped a piece from her document wrapping, not taking time to cut it neatly, and had begun stitching the cottage pattern immediately. She had worked quickly, using her own threads, including that navy blue, creating a visual map that would show the Henderson cottage and its true boundaries. But she hadn't finished. The embroidery showed signs of incomplete work, particularly around the edges. Eleanor had been interrupted, or had run out of time, or had decided that what she had created was sufficient for her purposes. And then she had gone to the sewing circle, bringing her usual violet embroidery for general viewing, while keeping the cottage pattern and the documents hidden and safe. Or so she had believed. But Mrs. Bright had also come to the sewing circle with plans of her own. She had positioned herself near the fireplace, near the cabinet containing Miss Brooker's thread supplies. She had watched Eleanor carefully, waiting for an opportunity. When had the switch occurred? When had the violet embroidery been replaced with the cottage pattern? Miss Marple thought back to the Thursday afternoon, reconstructing the sequence of events. Eleanor had arrived with her travelling work basket, had taken out her violet embroidery, had begun stitching. The other ladies had been moving about, taking tea, engaged in conversation. Mrs. Bright had stood by the fireplace for some time. She had been near enough to the tea things, near enough to Eleanor's work basket which sat beside her chair, near enough to accomplish what she needed to accomplish. The switch must have happened during the tea service, when attention was divided, and Eleanor herself might have set down her embroidery temporarily to accept her cup. A moment's distraction, a deft substitution, and the cottage pattern, brought by Mrs. Bright herself, would have replaced Eleanor's violets in the hoop. But why make the switch at all? Miss Marple pondered this question carefully. If Mrs. Bright's goal was simply to destroy evidence, she could have taken the violet embroidery and disposed of it. Instead, she had replaced it with the cottage pattern, ensuring that when Eleanor collapsed, this particular piece of embroidery would be found in her possession. Perhaps Mrs. Bright had intended to claim the cottage embroidery was Eleanor's attempt to frame her falsely. Perhaps she meant to argue that the evidence was fabricated, that Eleanor had created a false map to support spurious accusations. By having the cottage pattern in Eleanor's hoop at the moment of collapse, Mrs. Bright could later produce it as proof of Eleanor's supposed dishonesty. A clever plan, Miss Marple reflected. And it would have worked too if Eleanor had not been so thorough in creating multiple forms of evidence, and if she had not hidden the original documents so carefully. The missing piece of linen had revealed the truth. It showed that Eleanor had torn fabric from her document wrapping to create the cottage embroidery as legitimate evidence, not as a fabrication. The torn edges proved the connection between the embroidery and the hidden papers, and it showed something else as well, that Eleanor Finch had been working desperately on Thursday morning after Mrs. Bright's visit, creating additional documentation because she knew she was in danger. Miss Marple looked at the documents spread before her, at the embroideries with their silent testimony, at the torn linen that connected them all. Eleanor Finch had stitched truth into fabric. Now it remained to be seen whether that truth could save her, or at least ensure that justice was served. Chapter 9. The Meeting Behind Closed Doors. Miss Marple had spent Saturday morning in careful consultation with Dr. Haydock and the constable Marple. The doctor had been initially resistant to the notion that Eleanor Finch's collapse might have been anything other than a stroke, but Miss Marple's quiet presentation of the evidence, the switched embroidery, the property documents, the timeline of events, had given him pause. "I'll arrange for certain tests to be conducted," he had said grimly. "If there are traces of anything untoward in Miss Finch's system, we'll find them. Though I must say, Miss Marple, if you're correct in your suspicions, this is a very grave matter indeed." "Murder generally is," Miss Marple had replied gently. By Sunday afternoon, Mr. Haydock had his answer. Eleanor Finch's collapse had not been caused by a stroke, but by the introduction of a substantial quantity of digitalis into her system, enough to cause severe cardiac distress, unconsciousness, and quite possibly death, had medical attention not been summoned promptly. Digitalis, de Haydock explained to the small group assembled in his surgery, is derived from foxglove. In controlled doses, it's used medicinally for heart conditions. In excessive amounts, it's a poison. Miss Finch's symptoms, the sudden collapse, the cardiac irregularity, are entirely consistent with digitalis poisoning. Constable Polk removed his helmet and turned it thoughtfully in his hands. And you believe, Miss Marple, that Mrs. Bright administered this poison during the sewing circle meeting? I believe she had both motive and opportunity, Miss Marple replied. The documents Miss Finch had compiled prove that Mrs. Bright has been profiting from fraudulent property boundaries for decades. Miss Finch confronted her with this evidence on Tuesday and made clear her intention to expose the fraud publicly. Mrs. Bright visited Miss Finch on Thursday morning ostensibly to plead or negotiate, but in reality to observe what evidence existed and to plan her response. And the embroidery? Constable Polk asked. I confess I don't entirely understand the significance of all this needlework. Miss Marple explained patiently about the violet pattern with its hidden notations, about the cottage embroidery that served as a visual map, about the torn linen that connected the documents to the stitched evidence. She described how Mrs. Bright had attempted to obtain navy thread at the haberdashery, how she had switched the embroideries during the sewing circle, and how she had positioned herself near both the tea service and Eleanor's work basket. The digitalis would have been simple enough to introduce into Miss Finch's tea, she concluded. A powder dissolved in liquidax quickly and would have been virtually undetectable in the moment. Mrs. Bright served tea at Miss Brooker's home frequently enough to know the arrangements. She had only to wait for the right moment when attention was elsewhere. But surely others would have noticed, Constable Polk objected. A room full of ladies all sitting about with their sewing. Someone must have seen something. People see what they expect to see, Miss Marple said, and they don't expect to witness poisoning at a village sewing circle. Mrs. Bright is a respectable woman well regarded in the community. The very notion that she might be capable of such an act would seem absurd to most observers. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. It's the perfect setting for it, really. Everyone comfortable, distracted by conversation and handiwork, tea being served casually. A few moments of inattention would be all that was required. Then we must bring Mrs. Bright in for questioning, Constable Polk said with decision. Though I confess I'm not looking forward to it. She'll deny everything naturally, and without witnesses to the actual act. I believe, Miss Marple said quietly, that if we confront Mrs. Bright with the full weight of evidence, the property documents, the embroideries, the digitalis poisoning, she may find denial difficult to maintain. Particularly if we explain that we know about her Thursday morning visit to Miss Finch's cottage and her inquiry at the haberdashery about navy thread. And so it was arranged. On Monday afternoon, a small group gathered at Miss Brooker's cottage by invitation. Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, Constable Polk, Mrs. Vernon, and several members of the sewing circle, including Mrs. Hawtrey. Miss Brooker, pale and anxious, had agreed to the use of her sitting room for what Miss Marple had carefully described as a discussion of recent events. Mrs. Bright arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, her manner composed though her eyes were wary. She took in the assembled company with a single sweeping glance, and Miss Marple saw understanding dawn in her expression. Mrs. Bright, Constable Polk began formally, we have some questions regarding the events of Thursday afternoon and your relationship with Miss Eleanor Finch. I'm happy to assist in any way I can, Mrs. Bright replied, her voice steady. Though I can't imagine what questions you might have. Poor Eleanor collapsed from a stroke, a terrible tragedy but hardly mysterious. Not a stroke, de Haydock said bluntly. Digitalis poisoning, administered in sufficient quantity to cause severe cardiac distress and unconsciousness. The colour drained from Mrs. Bright's face, but she rallied quickly. Poisoning? That's absurd. Are you suggesting that someone deliberately poisoned Eleanor? But who would do such a thing? Someone, Miss Marple said gently, who had reason to want Miss Finch silenced before she could expose a long-standing fraud involving property boundaries and illegal land appropriation. She laid the documents on the table one by one, the 1847 survey, the suspicious and 23 boundary change, Eleanor's detailed research notes. Mrs. Bright's eyes followed each paper as it was placed, her expressions growing increasingly rigid. These documents prove that in 1923, following the death of the Henderson couple, the boundary between Henderson Cottage and Bright House was moved illegally, Miss Marple continued. Approximately 15 feet of Henderson property was incorporated into your land without authorization or compensation to the rightful heir. Miss Finch discovered this fraud and confronted you with the evidence on Tuesday afternoon in the churchyard. I don't... Mrs. Bright's composure was cracking. Mrs. Hawtrey witnessed that confrontation, Miss Marple said, and Mrs. Hawtrey nodded reluctantly. You were seen arguing with Miss Finch, and she was observed showing you papers, the same papers we now have before us. On Tuesday evening, Miss Marple continued relentlessly, but without raising her voice, you went to the village haberdashery seeking navy blue thread to match a sample you carried. When told the colour was unavailable, you asked about Miss Finch's personal supplies. You learned where she lived from Miss Collins, the shopkeeper's daughter. Mrs. Bright's hands gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. On Thursday morning you visited Miss Finch's cottage. You stayed approximately 20 minutes and raised voices were heard. You left looking flushed and agitated. You had gone to assess the situation, to see what evidence Eleanor had compiled, to understand how she intended to present it. And that afternoon, Dr. Haydock added, you attended the sewing circle carrying digitalis, derived, I suspect, from foxglove that grows in many gardens, including your own. You waited for your opportunity, and when Miss Finch was distracted, you introduced the poison into her tea. You also, Miss Marple said, producing the cottage embroidery, switched Miss Finch's violet pattern for this cottage design. You'd work this piece yourself, perhaps intending to later claim it was Eleanor's attempt to fabricate evidence. You used navy thread from Miss Brooker's supplies, the same shade you had sought at the haberdashery to outline certain features. She placed the torn linen beside the embroidery, showing how they connected. But Miss Finch had been thorough. She had created multiple forms of evidence, hidden her documents carefully, and left a trail that could be followed by anyone who took the trouble to look carefully. Mrs. Bright sat very still, her face a mask. Then slowly the mask began to crumble. Her shoulders sagged, and she seemed to age years in moments. She wouldn't listen, Mrs. Bright said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I tried to reason with her. I explained that the boundary change had been my husband's doing, that I had merely maintained what he established, that it had been decades ago, that no one had been harmed, that the current owners had no knowledge or claim. But Eleanor wouldn't listen. She kept talking about truth and principle and setting things right. So you decided to silence her, Constable Polk said. Mrs. Bright's laugh was bitter. I decided to protect what was mine, my home, my position, my reputation. Eleanor was going to destroy everything over a piece of land that meant nothing to anyone except her precious principles. It meant something to the rightful owners, Mrs. Vernon said quietly, from her position near the window. Mrs. Bright looked at her with something approaching contempt. The rightful owners sold the cottage years ago, none the wiser. No harm was done. Except, Miss Marple said gently, to Miss Finch, who lies unconscious in hospital, and to truth itself, which you attempted to bury along with your fraud. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Bright seemed to shrink into herself, and when Constable Polk stepped forward with the formal words of arrest, she offered no resistance. Chapter 10. What was sown in secret. 3 weeks had passed since Mrs. Bright's arrest, and autumn had settled more firmly over St. Mary Mead. The trees along the high street wore their bronze and gold with the comfortable assurance of the season, and the evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and turning leaves. Miss Marple sat in Eleanor Finch's hospital room, her knitting in her lap, watching the older woman sleep. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic for the past week. Eleanor had regained consciousness 5 days after Mrs. Bright's confession, weak and confused but slowly recovering. The digitalis had been administered in a quantity intended to kill, but de Haydock's prompt treatment and Eleanor's fundamental constitution had saved her life. She is a fighter, de Haydock had said with professional satisfaction, though it will be months before she's fully recovered. Eleanor's eyes opened now, focusing gradually on Miss Marple's face. A faint smile touched her lips. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice still weak but growing stronger each day. "My niece tells me you've been visiting daily. You needn't trouble yourself." "It's no trouble," Miss Marple replied, setting down her knitting. "I find hospital visiting quite restful, actually, and I thought you might like to know that your embroidery work has been much admired." Eleanor's expression sharpened with interest. "My embroidery?" "Your documentation, rather. The violet pattern with its hidden notations, the cottage map showing the true boundaries, the carefully preserved surveys and research. All of it has been presented as evidence in the case against Mrs. Bright. Her solicitor attempted to argue that the embroidered map was fabricated, but the torn linen proved the connection to your legitimate documentation. It was quite brilliant, really, using needlework as a form of record-keeping." A flush of pleasure coloured Eleanor's pale cheeks. "I thought if I could show the boundaries visually, people would understand more immediately. Legal documents can be so dry, but a picture, or in this case an embroidered representation, makes the truth clear to everyone." "It certainly did that," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I confess I'm curious about one thing. Why create two violet patterns? The one you brought to the sewing circle, and the one you hid in the bag under your window seat?" Eleanor's expression grew troubled. "After Amelia visited me on Thursday morning, I realised how dangerous the situation had become. She was desperate, cornered. I worried she might try to destroy or alter my evidence at the sewing circle. So I brought a decoy, the violet pattern from my regular basket, which had only basic notations that could be explained away as personal reminders. The more detailed version, with extensive measurements and cross-references, I left hidden at home along with the documents." "Very wise," Miss Marple said. "Though I don't think you anticipated that she would poison you."
"She..."
Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "I thought perhaps she might try to steal my embroidery or cause some sort of scene. But murder," she shook her head slowly. "I should have realised. Greed and fear together create a dangerous compound." "They do indeed!" Miss Marple was silent for a moment, remembering her own words about human nature remaining constant regardless of setting. "Mrs. Bright will stand trial in the new year. Her confession, combined with the physical evidence and testimony from multiple witnesses, makes the outcome quite certain. And the property? The fraudulent boundary has been corrected. The new owners of Henderson Cottage have been informed of the true property lines, and Mrs. Bright's estate will compensate them accordingly. Your work has ensured that a 60-year-old wrong has finally been set right." Eleanor closed her eyes, and Miss Marple thought she saw tears glisten on her lashes. "My headmistress used to say that education was about teaching girls to think clearly and act justly, regardless of personal cost. I suppose I was still teaching in my own way." "You were," Miss Marple said gently, "though the lesson was rather more dangerous than Latin conjugations or embroidery stitches." A faint smile crossed Eleanor's face. "The embroidery stitches proved rather useful in the end, didn't they?" Mrs. Vernon arrived shortly after, carrying a basket of items from Eleanor's cottage. "I thought you might want these," she said, setting the basket on the bedside table. "Your favourite shawl, some books, and—" She hesitated, then drew out a carefully wrapped bundle. "The violet embroidery. The one from your home basket. I've completed it for you. Just the basic pattern, nothing fancy. I thought you might like to see it finished." Eleanor unwrapped it with trembling fingers. The row of violets was complete now, each petal precisely shaded in purple and green, the whole piece a testament to patient, methodical work. The hidden notations were still there along the edges, visible only if one knew to look for them. "It's beautiful," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you." Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to take her leave, giving aunt and niece their privacy. But Eleanor's voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Marple, my niece tells me it was your careful observation that uncovered the truth. The switched embroidery, the bent needle, the navy thread, all the small details that everyone else overlooked." "I merely noticed what was there to be seen," Miss Marple replied. "You had done all the essential work, documenting the fraud, creating multiple forms of evidence, protecting the truth as best you could. I simply followed the threads you had left behind." Eleanor smiled at the phrase. "Followed the threads? Yes, I suppose that's exactly what you did. Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing what needed to be seen and for ensuring that truth prevailed." Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, her knitting bag over her arm, her mind peaceful. The sewing circle would meet again on Thursday. Miss Brooker had tentatively suggested resuming their gatherings, though the atmosphere would undoubtedly be subdued for some time. Mrs. Bright's chair would remain conspicuously empty, a reminder of how far people could fall when they chose expediency over principle. But Eleanor Finch would recover. Miss Marple felt certain of that, and when she did, she would return to her embroidery, to her quiet cottage, to her life of careful observation and methodical documentation. Perhaps she would be more cautious in future, less trusting of human nature's better impulses, or perhaps not. Eleanor Finch was, at her core, a teacher who believed in truth and justice. Such convictions, once formed, were not easily altered by adversity. Miss Marple thought of the completed violet embroidery, of its hidden notations that bore witness to careful research and determined purpose. She thought of the cottage pattern with its 3 precisely placed windows, of the torn linen that proved authenticity, of the bent needle that told its own story of urgent work and protective care. "Truth, like thread, may be thin," she murmured to herself as she opened her garden gate, "but it holds fast when stitched with care." And in the case of Eleanor Finch versus Amelia Bright, truth had indeed held fast, woven through documents and embroidery, preserved in hidden bags and careful notations maintained despite attempts to obscure, alter, or destroy it. In the end, as Miss Marple had always believed, truth had its own resilience. It might be buried, but it could not be permanently silenced. It might be attacked, but it could not be defeated. Not when someone cared enough to stitch it carefully into the fabric of evidence, one patient thread at a time.